Hey, I want to talk to you just for a few minutes, excuse me, about an extended, I guess you could call it an extended explanation of operant conditioning. Sorry about that. This is a kind of a condensed version. Um, and I want to talk specifically about escape and avoidance behavior. That's behavior that is learned, at least the way we're going to discuss it. There is an element of nature to this where we um, know instinctively to avoid certain things and situations, but this is predominantly a nurtured in kind of a learning. So that means simply that this can be classical conditioning and it can also be operant conditioning. Primarily, we're going to deal with the classical conditioning side of this. So what is it? You I'll say we're starting with classical, but you have to remember operant conditioning. Negative reinforcement in operant conditioning, removal of an adverse stimulus that follows a response, and that increases the likelihood of a repeat performance. If you if you do something that you are, let's say, expected. If I expect you to do something, or I ask you to do something, and you do that, then I may take away something that's unpleasant. And that's called negative reinforcement. And easily confused with punishment. We're not talking about punishment here. We're talking about taking away something that you may not have much pleasure with, but you did a good thing prior to that. So I go, okay, well, you don't have to clean your room today. Hope that makes sense. And so that's that's the kind of thinking we're talking about. I think your textbook for this uses swatting at a wasp that's flying around you in your face or whatever, and it flies away. So the next time the wasp comes around, you're going to swat again. Well, that's kind of a classical conditioning. Because the wasp left the first time, you're conditioned to just almost naturally wave your hand at it to scare it away, and it goes away. That's a negative reinforcement. You will do it thinking that the wasp will go away again. So that's kind of an escape, kind of an avoidance view, if you will, of how we deal with things in the realm of negative reinforcement. So starts raining, you run indoors. I think that's another one of your textbook things. And you avoid the rain because you went inside. So this is an avoidance behavior. Uh, you first learn escape from adverse situations. We like to call that stimulus. So you first learn to escape from an adverse stimulus, and then you learn to avoid it. So there's a basic learning, and then there's a higher learning that takes place. We like to work with rats and in the lab and do different things that aren't harmful to them. Sometimes a little unpleasant, maybe, but doesn't really harm them, doesn't hurt them. Matter of fact, you can't do harmful things in research, regardless of what it is you're working with, rat or otherwise. So we uh, can do these experiments using like electric shock, very mild electric shock, kind of like get their attention and then watch what their reaction is. And there's some good information in your textbook just about how an experiment like that works. So please read that. I don't know what the page number is, but it's in section 9.1, chapter 9.1, and you can read about what I'm discussing here. Now, with that in mind, let's kind of take a look at avoidance related to what we just spoke about. Let's look more at avoidance than escape. Escape is pretty easy to understand, uh, at least from theory. When you're escaping from something that's unpleasant, right, then that's going to condition itself. So we know that I don't like cold weather, especially when it's windy. So what do? Hear the forecast. I don't go outside. That's escape, or that's avoidance rather. If I'm out there and I have to get away from it, then that's escape. I hope that makes sense. Pretty simplistic, but hey, we're all kind of the same when it comes out, I guess, unless you're from Alaska. So what happened? Research kind of leaned toward avoidance. Escape is simple to understand, avoidance not so much. So what researchers did was came up with kind of a two process, they call it a two process theory. It doesn't really have a name. It's also known as two factor theory of avoidance. And Maurer is the researcher. He's done a lot of other things, by the way, but I won't get into those. This guy's been around a while. I think he's dead now. I'm not too sure. But he worked in the Pavlov realm, um, with neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, leading to conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So this is stuff you've already had. This is stuff from Intro to Psych. Very easy to remember. Pavlov, ring the bell, the dogs slobber, because they know they're going to get fed, and then you change who's feeding them, etc. So what did Maurer do? He borrowed from that. And here's what he said. Two process theory of avoidance actually contains two explanations. Avoidance behavior is the result of two processes. Classical conditioning, where the fear response is caused by conditioned stimulus, and then operant conditioning, moving away from the conditioned stimulus because of the classical conditioning that took place prior to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that classical conditioning, and now when something when something I don't like occurs, then I avoid it. It's pretty simple, but there's some problems with this. The Can you remove it? We could get into extinguishing, etc., but we don't have time for it at the moment. But bear in mind that there is this process called extinguishing, where you remove one of the stimuli, and then hopefully that removes the behavior. And that's one of the problems with this theory, this two-factor theory that was proposed. Avoidance responses are pretty persistent. So maybe I end one of the stimuli, but the behavior continues. Now, is that good or bad? It depends on what it is you're trying to avoid, I suppose. So, what was found was the persistence part of this couldn't be accounted for in this two process theory. If you consistently experience the conditioned stimulus, then you are going to continuously display a conditioned response. And maybe we want you to stop doing that uh, because it becomes undesirable after a time. There could be a million and one reasons, but the point of this is that the two process theory didn't really it's kind of like functionalism with William James. It was a good explanation at the moment, but it lost steam as more sophisticated ways of research came into being. So, what if there's insufficient exposure, for example, but you still get the persistence? I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. So, and that's one of the problems. The second problem was repeated avoidance caused no evidence of fear in the case of the experiment that was being done using dogs. I don't want to get too involved in that because you can read about what that experiment was all about. So dogs, being on a higher level of intelligence than a rat is, were exposed to this fear, this stimulus that caused fear, and then once they had become accustomed to that, they showed an avoidance response. In other words, the fear went away. So that causes again some problems with this two-factor thing. Um, there are other theories: avoidance behavior, process theory. That's a very popular one. It says the act of avoidance is negatively reinforced simply by the lower rate of aversion stimulation. In other words, if you don't stimulate enough, then you lose the avoidance. The reinforcement is not there. So that's kind of a brief brush over. Um, and the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is because you probably will never hear it anywhere else. But you experience this every single day. Think about it. You escape things and you avoid things. Why do you escape them and avoid them? It's not just, oh, yeah, I'm supposed to do that. You learned that, and that becomes a part of your behavior scheme. I don't go out in the cold weather. That's avoidance. Why not? Well, I've had bad experiences out there. When I was young, I didn't own a good coat, or but whatever. You make up the scenario. It doesn't matter. Starts with escape and becomes avoidance. Learned classical conditioning, given over to operant conditioning, which is the avoidance. Stay inside with a temperature set at 72 degrees, much more pleasant unless you're somebody that likes cold weather than hanging around and it's 15 degrees and the wind's blowing 30 miles an hour. Hope all that stuff makes sense. That's a short lecture, but I think it's pertinent. I may pop you with a lecture again this week toward the back side of next week, toward the back side, that talks about avoidance conditioning and phobias. There are a lot of phobias out there. Can't begin to tell you what they are. There's a phobia for having phobias, if that tells you anything. Phobia. And that's real. That's a true name for it. Okay, so enough of the babbling. Talk to you soon.